On Christmas morning in 2024, a battered oil tanker called the Eagle S was crawling through the Gulf of Finland when it did something no cargo ship should ever do. It dropped its anchor and left it down. For more than 6 hours and across some 60 miles of freezing seabed, that steel anchor scraped along the bottom of the Baltic Sea like a claw until it caught something and tore it apart. What it tore apart was not a rock or a wreck. It was part of the nervous system of two nations. In the space of a single afternoon, the Estlink 2 power connector between Finland and Estonia went dark, and several communication cables were severed. Millions of people never noticed. Their messages still sent, their video calls still connected, because somewhere, engineers were quietly rerouting the traffic of an entire region around a wound on the ocean floor. And that is the first thing you have to understand about the world you live in. The internet is not in the air. It is not in a cloud. It is lying in the cold and the dark at the bottom of the sea, and it is far more fragile than anyone wants you to believe. Right now, as you watch this, roughly 99% of all the data moving between continents, every email, every bank transfer, every military order, every stock trade, every frame of this video is traveling through a few hundred cables no thicker than a garden hose, buried in mud and draped across undersea mountains. There are around 500 of them. Together, they stretch about 1.4 million kilometers, enough to loop the planet more than 30 times. And almost no one can tell you who owns them, who guards them, or how quickly the modern world would stop if enough of them were cut. For most of the last century, that was a boring question, the kind of thing only telephone engineers cared about. But in the last 10 years, something changed. A handful of the most powerful companies on Earth quietly went to sea. A handful of governments realized that these thin glass threads were the single most important and most exposed infrastructure on the planet. And ships started dropping anchors in very strange places. This is the story of the invisible map that actually runs the world. Who drew it? Who owns it? Who is listening on it? And who is learning, one severed cable at a time, exactly how to switch it off? Follow the cables, and you follow the real architecture of money, power, and war in the 21st century. It begins, as it always does, with a lie we tell ourselves about the cloud. We have been sold a word that hides everything. The cloud. It sounds soft, weightless, everywhere and nowhere. Store your photos in the cloud. Run your company from the cloud. But there is no cloud. There is only someone else's computer, in someone else's building, connected to your device by a physical thread. And when that thread has to cross an ocean, it becomes one of the most extraordinary objects human beings have ever built. The deep-sea version of that thread is roughly the width of a garden hose. At its heart sit strands of glass thinner than a human hair, so pure that if the ocean itself were made of this glass, you could still see the bottom miles down. Through those strands travel pulses of laser light, flickering on and off billions of times a second, carrying your bank balance and a stranger's heartbeat and a government's secrets, all braided together, all moving at nearly the speed of light. Wrap that glass in steel wire, in copper, in tar-soaked jute, and a sheath of polyethylene, and you have a submarine cable. In the deep ocean, it can be as slim as a marker pen, because out there, the only threats are pressure and time. Closer to shore, where anchors and trawlers and curious sharks roam, it thickens into something armored, like a steel python. And then, it simply disappears over the edge of the continental shelf, and falls into a world with less human presence than the surface of the moon. There are, at last count, more than 500 of these systems in service or about to be, some 532 live and another 77 planned by one 2024 tally, knitting the continents together across about 1.4 million kilometers of seabed. Satellites, for all the noise around constellations like Starlink, still carry only a sliver of intercontinental traffic. The real number, the one that matters, is that these cables move somewhere between 95 and 99% of everything that crosses an ocean digitally. Cut the cables, and the satellites cannot catch what falls. So when a politician talks about cybersecurity, or a chief executive talks about the cloud, remember what they are actually standing on. A few hundred glass threads in the dark, most of them unguarded, many of them owned by companies whose names you know far better than you know the ships that lay them. To understand how we got here, how the most important network in history ended up on the seabed, you have to go back to a time before the internet, before the telephone, to a mad idea and a very rich man who wanted to shake hands with the future across 3,000 miles of water. In 1858, a New York financier named Cyrus West Field did something most sensible people considered impossible. He laid a telegraph cable across the entire Atlantic Ocean, from Valentia Island off the coast of Ireland to Heart's Content in Newfoundland. For a few glorious weeks, messages that once took 10 days by ship crossed the ocean in minutes. Queen Victoria sent a note of congratulation to President James Buchanan, cities lit fireworks, and a jeweler in New York sold off the leftover cable as souvenirs. And then, after just 3 weeks, the cable went silent and died. It took Field 8 more years, a civil war, and a fortune to finish the job. But in 1866, the connection held, and it never really broke again. Not the connection, and not the pattern it set. Because from that moment on, a simple rule governed the modern world. Whoever owns the cable owns the conversation. The British Empire understood this better than anyone. It wrapped the globe in a web of telegraph lines, nicknamed the All-Red Line. And when the First World War broke out, one of its very first acts was to haul up Germany's undersea cables and cut them, forcing the enemy onto routes the British could intercept. For nearly a century, the cables carried dots and dashes, then voices. In 1956, a system called TAT-1 became the first cable to carry telephone calls across the Atlantic. And this marvel of engineering could handle a grand total of 35 conversations at once. Presidents and prime ministers had to book time on it. The entire spoken traffic between 2 continents fit through a pipe narrower than a single modern phone call. Then, in 1988, everything changed. A cable called TAT-8 became the first to cross the Atlantic using fiber optics, hair-thin glass instead of copper, and its capacity was so vast that engineers at the time quietly worried it might never be filled. 40,000 simultaneous calls, where TAT-1 had carried 35. They were spectacularly wrong. Within a few years, the world was inventing the web, and the appetite for capacity became bottomless. The glass thread had arrived, just in time to carry the internet. What followed was an arms race in light. Consortiums of telephone companies, the old giants, AT&T, France Telecom, British Telecom, pooled their money to lay ever fatter cables because no single company could afford them alone. For decades, that consortium model was simply how the world worked. The cables were shared infrastructure, boring and collective, like roads or sewers. And then, quietly, in the span of a single decade, that century-old arrangement was overturned. Not by governments, not by phone companies, but by 4 American corporations that decided the ocean floor was theirs to buy. To understand why they wanted it, though, you first have to understand just how hard it is to put a cable down there in the first place. Building a submarine cable is one of those feats of modern engineering that almost no one witnesses and almost everyone depends on. It begins strangely with maps of the seabed, more detailed than most maps of Mars. Surveys to find a route that avoids underwater volcanoes, earthquake zones, coral, shipwrecks, and the anchors of the world's busiest ports. A single transoceanic cable, around 7,000 kilometers long, costs on the order of $250 million before it carries a single byte. Then comes the ship. And here is the first hidden weakness of the entire system. There are only around 60 cable ships in the whole world capable of laying and repairing these lines, and many of them are aging. These vessels carry thousands of kilometers of coiled cable in their bellies and pay it out over the stern as they crawl across the ocean at the speed of a walking man, day and night, for weeks. Near shore, a sea plow rides the seabed ahead of the cable, cutting a trench and burying the line as it goes, so trawlers and anchors pass harmlessly overhead. In the deep, the cable is simply laid on the bottom and left to the dark. The cables themselves come from an even smaller club. For decades, essentially 3 companies have built most of the world's submarine cable: Subcom in the United States, Alcatel Submarine Networks in France, and NEC in Japan. In the last few years, a 4th has come charging in from China: HMN Technologies, formerly known as Huawei Marine. And as we'll see, its rise has turned cable laying into a matter of national security. The manufacturing bottleneck is so tight that some cable makers now quote backlogs measured not in months, but in years. Once laid, a cable is usually owned not by one company, but by a consortium, a club of investors who split the cost and the capacity, while third-party contractors handle the laying and the repairs. When something goes wrong, and it always eventually does, a repair ship has to sail out, locate the break with electrical pulses, drag a grapnel across the seabed to hook the cable, haul both severed ends to the surface, splice them by hand under a microscope, and lower the whole thing back down. In good conditions, the on-site work takes 10 to 20 days. Counting the weight for a ship and the weather, the average repair stretches closer to 55.
Hold that number in your mind, because it is the hidden flaw beneath everything that follows. It is cheap and fast to cut a cable. A dragged anchor will do it in an afternoon. It is expensive and agonizingly slow to fix one. That asymmetry is the crack running through the foundation of the digital world. And for most of the cable era, it didn't matter, because the people laying cable were sleepy telephone monopolies. That is exactly what changed when Silicon Valley looked at the map of the ocean floor and saw not a public utility, but a private opportunity. Here is a number that ought to be far more famous than it is. Before 2012, the four American technology giants, Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft, together owned less than 10% of the world's undersea cable capacity. By 2022, that figure was about 66%. On the busiest route on Earth, the North Atlantic, their share of capacity rose from roughly 10% in 2014 to around 90% a decade later. In the span of one decade, 4 companies went from bystanders to landlords of the ocean floor. The scale of it is staggering when you count the holes. Google alone now has a stake in more than 30 submarine cables, 17 of which it owns outright, entire private highways of light with no other tenants. It has given them the names of scientists and explorers: Curie, running 10,500 kilometers from Los Angeles down to Chile; Dunant, crossing the Atlantic to France; Grace Hopper, reaching from New York to Britain and Spain; Equiano, sweeping 15,000 kilometers down the west coast of Africa. Meta holds interests in around 16 cables, Microsoft in 6, Amazon in 4.
And they are not finished. Meta is the anchor behind 2 Africa, a cable that wraps the entire African continent across some 45,000 kilometers. Then, in early 2025, Meta announced something even more audacious: Project Waterworth, a cable it says will be the longest on Earth, a roughly 50,000 kilometer loop stitching together 5 continents. A single company proposing to lace the whole planet with its own private nervous system. These are not the sleepy consortiums of the telephone age. These are among the largest concentrations of private power in history, and they are building their own roads across the sea. The capacities involved are almost incomprehensible. Google's Grace Hopper cable can carry around 350 terabits per second. To put that in perspective, Taydate, the first fiber cable, carried the equivalent of 40,000 phone calls. A single modern cable carries the equivalent of hundreds of millions. And increasingly, the traffic on these private cables is not you at all. It is the machines. Data centers talking to data centers. Artificial intelligence models being trained across oceans. The cables are becoming the internal plumbing of a few corporate empires that happen to also run the internet you use. This is the quiet coup at the heart of our story. Not a dramatic takeover, not a headline, just a slow, deliberate migration of the most critical infrastructure on the planet from public, shared, collective ownership into the hands of 4 private companies. Companies that answer to shareholders, not to voters. Companies whose cables cross the territory of nations that had no say in the matter. The obvious question is the one almost no one stops to ask. Why? Why would a company that sells search ads or online shopping spend billions of dollars building ships and burying glass at the bottom of the sea? The first answer is the least interesting, and the most important: money. For decades, if Google or Facebook wanted to move data across an ocean, they had to rent space on someone else's cable, paying the old telecom consortiums a toll for every bit. When you are moving as much data as Google moves, those tolls become astronomical. At a certain scale, it stops making sense to rent, and it starts making sense to own. Build your own cable, and after the upfront cost, the ocean is effectively free. The second answer is control. When you own the cable end to end, you decide how much capacity to build, where it lands, when to upgrade it, and who else, if anyone, gets to use it. You are no longer waiting behind a consortium's committee. In an industry where being a few milliseconds faster than a rival can be worth billions, owning the physical path means owning your own destiny. Latency, the tiny delay as light crawls across the sea, becomes something you can engineer rather than beg for. The third answer is the one that explains the timing: artificial intelligence. Training and running the enormous models behind the current AI boom means moving oceans of data between data centers scattered around the globe. The appetite is effectively infinite, and it is growing faster than the old telecom industry could ever hope to build for. So the companies with the deepest pockets and the greatest hunger simply stopped waiting. They became their own telecom industry, laying private cable to feed private machines. Step back and you can see the shape of it: vertical integration on a planetary scale. These companies already own the data centers, the software, the services, and the devices in your pocket. Now they own the roads between them. It is as if a single retailer owned not just the stores and the warehouses, but the highways connecting them, and could decide who else was allowed to drive. When one company controls every layer, from the seabed to the search bar, the line between a business and infrastructure the world cannot function without quietly dissolves. There is nothing illegal about any of this, and much of it has genuinely made the internet faster and cheaper. But it concentrates something that used to be spread thin. It means the resilience of the global internet increasingly depends on the engineering decisions and the goodwill of a handful of boardrooms in California and Washington state. And it raises a question that sharpens the deeper you go. If the cables are so valuable to the companies that own them, how valuable are they to the nations they pass through, or past, or under? Because ownership is only one kind of power over a cable. Geography is another. And geography does not belong to Google. Spread a map of the world's submarine cables in front of you. And at first, it looks reassuringly dense. A tangle of lines connecting every coast, like the veins in a leaf. But look closer, and the illusion of resilience falls apart. Those hundreds of cables do not spread evenly across the oceans. They bunch together again and again, funneling through a handful of narrow places where geography forces them to converge. These are the choke points, and they are the true pressure points of the digital world. Consider the journey of a message from London to Singapore. It does not take some clever distributed path. It runs down through the Mediterranean, squeezes through the Suez corridor and across Egypt, drops into the Red Sea, threads the narrow Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, crosses the Indian Ocean, and funnels through the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia. At nearly every one of those steps, dozens of the world's most important cables lie side by side on the seabed, sometimes within a few kilometers of one another, in water shallow enough for an anchor to reach. The most astonishing of these choke points is Egypt. By some estimates, around 17% of all the world's internet traffic passes through this single country, and more than 90% of the data flowing between Europe and Asia comes ashore on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, is carried overland across the country, and returns to the sea at the Red Sea. There is no easy way around it. The geography that made Egypt the crossroads of the ancient world, the land bridge between three continents, has made it the crossroads of the digital one. Then there's the Luzon Strait, the stretch of water between Taiwan and the Philippines, through which a huge share of East Asia's traffic flows, and which sits squarely inside the most militarized seascape on the planet. There's the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, where the very anchors that keep global trade moving are also the single greatest threat to the cables beneath them. Each of these places is a knot, where the redundancy of the internet, its famous ability to route around damage, quietly runs out. This is the paradox governments have only recently woken up to. The internet was designed to survive a nuclear war by routing around any single point of failure. But the physical layer beneath it was built for cost and convenience, not survival. And it is riddled with single points of failure. Narrow seas, where a few well-placed cuts could sever a continent from the network. For years, this was a theoretical worry, a line in an academic paper. Then, in country after country, ships began arriving at exactly those choke points and dropping their anchors. And the first place to feel what that truly means was the ancient crossroads itself, Egypt. For thousands of years, whoever controlled the narrow neck of land between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea controlled the trade of half the world. Pharaohs, Persians, the British Empire, the builders of the Suez Canal, all understood that Egypt was the hinge between East and West. What almost no one outside the industry realizes is that the same thing is now true of the internet. The cables that connect Europe to Asia, to East Africa, to the Gulf, nearly all of them come ashore in Egypt. They land at a small number of stations on the Mediterranean coast, near Alexandria and Port Said. From there, the data does not continue by sea. It is carried overland, across Egyptian soil, through terrestrial cables that run the length of the country to the Red Sea, where it plunges back into the water and continues east. Every one of those cables pays for the privilege. The state-linked operator, Telecom Egypt, collects a toll on an enormous share of the traffic passing between the hemispheres. It has been called, aptly, a digital Suez Canal, and like the original, it is a source of both immense revenue and immense vulnerability. The world got a preview of that vulnerability back in 2008, when a series of cable faults off the Egyptian coast, several blamed on ships' anchors, cut connectivity for tens of millions of people from the Middle East to India in a single stroke. Businesses stalled, call centers went dark, markets wobbled. It was a demonstration, written in outage maps, of just how much of the world's data hangs on one country's coastline and the narrow strip of land behind it. What makes Egypt so fascinating in our story is that its power is not the power of ownership. The cables are largely built and owned by others, including the tech giants and international consortiums. Its power is the power of place. Egypt cannot build Google's cables, but Google's cables cannot avoid Egypt. That gives Cairo a form of leverage no amount of Silicon Valley money can simply purchase away. And it explains why so many players are now spending fortunes trying, and mostly failing, to find a viable route around it. Egypt is the clearest illustration of a truth that runs through this entire story. The map of the internet is not neutral. It is a map of pinch points. And each pinch point is a place where money, sovereignty, and vulnerability collide. In Egypt, that collision produces tolls and outages. But move north into a colder and angrier sea, and the same geography produces something far more sinister. Not accidents and tariffs, but what investigators increasingly believe are deliberate acts of sabotage. To see the choke point turned into a weapon, you have to sail to the Baltic. Return now to that Christmas day in 2024, and the tanker Eagle S. On paper, it was an ordinary oil ship, flying the flag of the Cook Islands, a tiny Pacific nation with no obvious business in the frozen Baltic. In reality, investigators say, it was part of what has become known as Russia's shadow fleet, a ragtag armada of aging, obscurely owned tankers used to move sanctioned oil, and, increasingly, to do things a normal ship would never do. On that day, what the Eagle S did was drag its anchor across the seabed for more than 60 miles over some 6 hours, severing the Estlink 2 power connector and several communication cables between Finland and Estonia. What makes the Baltic so alarming is that this was not a one-off. By the reckoning of Finnish police, at least 11 cables and a gas pipeline have been damaged in the Baltic Sea over roughly 2 years. The Sea Lion 1 cable between Finland and Germany cut in late 2024. Links between Sweden and the Baltic states cut again and again. Each incident, taken alone, could be dismissed as an accident, a clumsy captain, a fault in the machinery. Taken together, they form a pattern that intelligence agencies across Northern Europe now describe with a specific and chilling term: hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is the art of hurting an adversary while preserving deniability, of staying just below the threshold that would trigger a real response. A dragged anchor is perfect for it. Was it sabotage, or was it an accident? A tanker captain can always claim the anchor slipped, that he never noticed 60 miles of scraping. The cable is cut either way. The message of vulnerability is sent either way. And the perpetrator can shrug either way. Moscow has dismissed the accusations as baseless, and yet the anchors keep finding the cables. Northern Europe has responded with something close to alarm. NATO launched a Baltic patrol mission called Baltic Sentry. Finland took the extraordinary step of seizing the Eagle S and, in 2025, formally charging its senior officers, a rare attempt to pierce the veil of deniability and put a name to the damage. Navies began shadowing suspicious vessels. But the defenders face the brutal asymmetry we identified earlier. There are thousands of kilometers of cable and only a handful of ships. And any tanker in the world can become a weapon, simply by lowering a piece of steel into the water.
The Baltic is a laboratory. What is being tested there, cable by severed cable, is a question every nation is now quietly asking. How much of a country's life can you switch off from the seabed? And how little can you be blamed for it? It is a rehearsal, and nowhere are the stakes of that rehearsal higher, or the shadow of a much larger war darker, than on a small cluster of islands in the Taiwan Strait, where cutting the cables may be the opening move of something far worse. The Matsu Islands are a scattering of rocks in the Taiwan Strait, close enough to mainland China that on a clear day you can see the towers of the Chinese coast. About 14,000 people live there, and their connection to the modern world, to Taiwan proper and everything beyond it, runs through just 2 submarine cables. In February 2023, within the space of 6 days, both of them were cut. A Chinese fishing vessel severed the first, a Chinese freighter severed the second, and just like that, the islands were dragged back toward the digital dark ages. For weeks, the residents of Matsu lived a preview of a very modern kind of siege. Card payments failed. Online bookings vanished. People queued to make calls over a limited microwave backup the government scrambled to activate. Taiwanese authorities were careful at the time to say there was no proof Beijing had deliberately ordered the cuts. But the effect was a live demonstration of how easily, and how deniably, a set of islands could be isolated. And everyone understood that Matsu is a miniature of Taiwan itself. Because Taiwan, the beating heart of the world's advanced semiconductor industry, is connected to the internet by only around a dozen submarine cables, most of which land on a small number of vulnerable stretches of coast. And the incidents have not stopped. In January 2025, a ship called the Shunshin 39 was accused of damaging a cable off northern Taiwan. Weeks later, another vessel, the Hongtai 58, was linked to damage on a cable serving the outlying Penghu Islands. Taipei has stopped calling these mere accidents. It now uses a different phrase: gray zone operations. The gray zone is that same territory of deniable aggression we saw in the Baltic, but here it sits under the shadow of a possible invasion. Military planners have long warned that one of the first moves in any Chinese campaign against Taiwan might not be a missile at all, but the quiet severing of the island's cables, cutting it off from the world, silencing its cries for help, sowing panic and confusion before a single soldier appears. Every cable cut in peacetime from this angle looks less like an accident and more like a rehearsal for that opening move. Taiwan has begun to respond, investing in satellite backups, in faster repair agreements, in treating its cables as the national security assets they plainly are. But the fundamental vulnerability remains. An island whose microchips power the entire planet hangs on a dozen threads of glass in contested water. And here our story takes a darker turn still. Because a cable can be cut by anchors dragged in the fog of a Cold War, but it can also be cut by the blast of a hot one, when a shooting conflict on the surface reaches all the way down to the ocean floor. For that, we sail to the Red Sea. In late 2023, the Houthi movement in Yemen began attacking ships in the Red Sea, firing missiles and drones at commercial vessels in what they described as pressure over the war in Gaza. The world watched the surface of that story: the burning tankers, the rerouted container ships, the spike in shipping costs as vessels chose to sail all the way around Africa rather than run the gauntlet. But beneath the waves, a quieter and arguably more dangerous drama was unfolding. Because the Red Sea is one of those choke points, and some of the most important cables on Earth run right through the fighting. In February 2024, a cargo ship called the Rubimar was struck by a Houthi missile. It did not sink at once. It drifted, crippled and abandoned, with its anchor down. And as it drifted, that dragging anchor is believed to have sliced through 3 major submarine cables on the seabed below, the systems known as EIG, SEACOM, and AAE-1, carrying a significant share of the traffic through that corridor. Estimates suggested roughly a quarter of the data moving through the Red Sea was disrupted in a single stroke, and engineers scrambled to reroute it around the wound. The chilling part is that this may not even have been deliberate. Whether the Houthis meant to cut the cables, or simply sank a ship that then cut them by accident,
The lesson is the same, and it is terrifying in its simplicity. You do not need a specialized submarine or a team of divers to sever the internet's backbone. You need a war near a choke point and a ship with an anchor. The surface conflict and the seabed conflict have become impossible to separate. Attack the ships, and you may cut the cables, whether you intended to or not.
And remember what runs through that particular corridor. This is the Europe to Asia route, the same flow that comes ashore in Egypt, just to the north. More than 90% of the data capacity between Europe and Asia funnels through this region. A determined effort to sever the cables here, in the middle of an active conflict where any cut can be blamed on the chaos of war, could inflict damage on global connectivity far out of proportion to the effort required. The Red Sea proved that a regional war can reach out and touch the whole planet's internet. So now we have three faces of the same threat. Egypt showed us the choke point as a toll booth. The Baltic showed us the choke point as a target for deniable sabotage. The Red Sea showed us the choke point as collateral damage in someone else's war. But there is a fourth face, older and more secretive than any of them. One that does not want to cut the cable at all. It wants to leave the cable perfectly intact and simply listen to everything that flows through it. To understand that, we have to go back to the Cold War and to a submarine creeping across the floor of a Soviet sea. In 1971, an American submarine called the USS Halibut slipped into the Sea of Okhotsk, deep inside Soviet waters, on one of the most audacious espionage missions of the entire Cold War. Its target was a single undersea cable running along the seabed, a military communications line linking a major Soviet naval base on the Kamchatka Peninsula to fleet headquarters on the mainland. The mission, codenamed Operation Ivy Bells, was not to cut that cable. It was to wrap a listening device around it and record everything the Soviet Navy said. The device was an engineering marvel, a tap that coiled around the cable without ever piercing it, picking up the signals through induction and storing them on tape. Every few weeks, divers from the submarine would return, retrieve the recordings, and install fresh tapes, which were carried back to the National Security Agency to be pored over. For roughly a decade, the United States listened in on the conversations of the Soviet fleet, and the Soviets never suspected a thing. The operation was finally betrayed in 1981, not by any technical failure, but by an NSA analyst named Ronald Pelton, who sold the secret to Moscow. Operation Ivy Bells revealed the fourth great truth about submarine cables. The most valuable thing you can do to a cable is often not to cut it, but to tap it. A severed cable announces itself instantly. A tapped cable betrays nothing. And where does the entire flow of a continent's data become easiest to intercept? At the choke points and the landing stations, the very same narrow places where the cables converge. Control a landing station, and you don't need a submarine. The data comes to you. This is not merely Cold War history. In 2013, the documents leaked by Edward Snowden revealed that the United States and Britain, through the NSA and its British counterpart, GCHQ, had built industrial-scale programs to harvest data directly from the world's fiber optic cables, often at those coastal choke points, sometimes with the cooperation of the telecom companies, sometimes without. The modern successor to the Halibut, a specially modified submarine called the USS Jimmy Carter, has been widely described as the Navy's underwater eavesdropper, purpose-built for operations on the seabed that remain classified to this day. So layer these threats on top of one another, and the picture grows genuinely unsettling. The cables can be owned, and are, by a handful of corporations. They can be squeezed at choke points by a handful of countries. They can be cut, deniably, by anyone with an anchor. And they can be silently tapped by the states with the technology to reach them. Every message you send runs this gauntlet. And in the last few years, all of these threats have fused into a single escalating contest between the two most powerful nations on Earth, a struggle for control of the seabed that is quietly redrawing the map of the internet itself. For most of the cable era, the question of who built a cable was a matter of price and engineering, not politics. That era is over. Today, when a new submarine cable is proposed, one of the first questions asked in Washington and Beijing is not how fast it will be, but whose company will build it and whose territory it will touch. The seabed has become the newest front in the confrontation between the United States and China.
a contest news outlets have started calling the next battlefield of the tech Cold War. The turning point came with a cable called the Pacific Light Cable Network, backed by Google and Facebook, designed to run from the United States straight to Hong Kong. It was nearly complete when the US government intervened.
A national security panel, known informally as Team Telecom, warned that the Hong Kong landing and the involvement of a Chinese partner with alleged links to Beijing's security services posed an unacceptable risk of surveillance. Regulators refused to allow the Hong Kong connection to switch on. The cable was ultimately rerouted to Taiwan and the Philippines, and the direct line to Hong Kong was simply abandoned. Hundreds of millions of dollars of glass left dark on the seabed.
Then the battle moved to the builders themselves. When a massive new cable called Seabed 6, 19,000 kilometers linking Southeast Asia to Europe, went out to tender, the Chinese champion HMN Technologies, the former Huawei Marine, reportedly bid around $475 million and was poised to win. Washington launched a quiet pressure campaign, dangling incentives and warnings at the consortium members. And in the end, the contract went instead to the American firm Subcom. The message was unmistakable. The United States would fight, cable by cable, to keep Chinese firms from building the physical internet. The result is a slow, deliberate splitting of the world's cable map into two camps. Cables backed by American and allied firms increasingly avoid Chinese territory and Chinese builders. China, in turn, accelerates its own cables, its own routes, its own landing stations, its own manufacturer, to serve itself and the countries within its orbit. The single, shared global internet the cables were once imagined to create is quietly bifurcating into two overlapping networks, divided not by software or censorship alone, but by the physical geography of who owns the wire. This is perhaps the most consequential shift of all, because it turns every cable into a statement of allegiance. To lay a cable is now to choose a side. And underneath this grand geopolitical chess match sits the same humble physical fragility we started with: the anchors, the 60 ships, the 55-day repairs. Because it does not matter how sophisticated your Cold War is, if the thing you are fighting over can be broken by a fishing boat and takes 2 months to mend. To see how dangerous that combination truly is, we have to return at last to the ships that fix the cables, and to how few of them there are. Every year, the world's submarine cables suffer somewhere between 150 and 200 faults. That number tends to surprise people, because they almost never notice. The reason they don't notice is redundancy. When a cable breaks, traffic is automatically rerouted through others, and engineers dispatch a repair ship to fix the wound before too many more can open. The system works precisely because breaks are usually random, scattered, and rare enough that the repair fleet can keep up. The overwhelming majority of these faults, by some estimates around 86%, are caused not by spies or saboteurs at all, but by the ordinary violence of fishing nets and dragged anchors. But now, look at that arrangement with the eyes of a strategist, rather than an engineer. The entire self-healing capacity of the global internet rests on a fleet of only around 60 specialized cable ships, many of them decades old, spread thinly across the whole planet. Each repair takes, on average, the better part of 2 months, once you count the wait for a ship, the voyage, and the weather. The system is beautifully tuned for the steady drip of accidental faults. It is not built, in any way, for a deliberate, simultaneous, coordinated series of cuts. Imagine an adversary that studied the map as carefully as we have in this video. It would not attack cables at random. It would strike the choke points: Egypt, the Red Sea, the Luzon Strait, the Baltic Narrows. And it would strike many cables at once, in the same few days, in waters where repair ships are scarce and permission to operate is hard to obtain. Suddenly, the redundancy that protects us evaporates, because too many wounds have opened at once, and there are not enough surgeons to close them. Weeks of degraded or severed connectivity across whole regions is not a science fiction scenario. It is arithmetic. This is the true weakness that all the ownership battles and espionage games ultimately rest upon. The cables carry the lifeblood of the modern economy. An estimated $10 trillion a day in financial transactions alone are thought to move across them. Yet the machinery to defend and repair them is thin, aging, and concentrated. Governments are only now beginning to respond. funding new cable ships, mapping their vulnerabilities, drawing up plans to protect landing stations, treating the seabed as sovereign territory to be patrolled. But building a cable ship takes years, and the threats are multiplying now.
We have traveled a long way from that anchor in the Baltic on Christmas Day. We have seen who owns the cables, why they bought them, where the world's data is forced to squeeze together, how it can be cut and tapped and fought over. Now it is time to pull all of it together, to look at the finished map of the invisible network that actually runs your life, and to ask the uncomfortable question it leaves behind. Because once you truly see this map, you can never quite look at the word online the same way again. Step back and take in the whole picture at once. 99% of everything that crosses an ocean digitally, your money, your messages, your medical records, your government's secrets, the training runs of the artificial intelligence that may reshape this century, travels through roughly 500 glass threads, lying in the dark on the ocean floor. A growing majority of that capacity is owned outright by 4 American corporations. Vast rivers of it are forced through a handful of narrow choke points, controlled by the accident of geography. All of it can be cut by an anchor, tapped by a submarine, and fought over by superpowers. And the whole system leans on about 60 ships to keep it alive. When you assemble those facts, the comforting language we use about the digital world starts to look like a kind of collective myth. There is no cloud. There is a cable in the cold. There is no borderless internet. There is a map of pinch points and landing stations and territorial waters. There is no purely private industry and no purely public one, but a strange new hybrid in which corporations own the roads, governments guard the doors, and rival empires maneuver in the dark below. The most modern thing in your life turns out to rest on the most physical, most vulnerable foundation imaginable. None of this is a conspiracy. No one planned it as a scheme. It is simply what happened when the cheapest way to move data collided with the geography of the planet and the ambitions of a few enormous companies and a handful of powerful states. That is what makes it so important to see clearly. The forces shaping the seabed are not hiding. They are just below the surface. In tender documents and regulatory filings and the quiet movements of ships with their anchors down. Follow the cables, and you find the real architecture of power in our time, laid bare on the ocean floor. If this map of the invisible world was new to you, then you understand exactly why this channel exists, to trace the hidden wiring beneath the stories everyone else tells only on the surface. If you want to keep following that wiring with us, consider subscribing and share this video with someone who still thinks their data lives in the sky. And tell us in the comments which unseen system you want us to map next: the ports, the pipelines, the satellites, or the money itself. The board is enormous, and we are only beginning to turn over the pieces. So here's the thought to carry with you the next time you send a message across the world, casually, without a second's thought. In the instant you hit send, those words dissolve into pulses of light and dive off the edge of a continent, racing through the black and silent deep, past the anchors of shadow fleets and the ears of listening submarines, squeezing through a strait where a single dragged chain could swallow them, before surfacing on the far shore, as if by magic. It never felt like a journey. It never felt like a risk, but it was both. And the people who understand that, who own and map and guard and threaten those thin glass threads in the dark, are quietly holding the nervous system of the entire modern world in their hands. The question that remains is the one this whole story has been building toward. Now that you can see the cables, who do you want holding them?